President Obama has in fact embraced the HSA with his current administration's plan.
Well, I think if you look at the letter that we sent the committee, we quoted Commonwealth Foundation, an independent nonprofit research group that shows that this provides what we call an underinsured group in the population. We also quoted Health Access, and we also quoted from Families USA.
Would the gentleman be kind enough as to provide me with the data that you have incorporated within your letter?
I would be, yes, Senator, I'd be glad to send you a copy.
All right, I'd be happy to have your letter to read it.
For those reasons, we are opposed to this bill.
Thank you.
Beth Capel on behalf of Health Access California. We are also opposed to this measure as it is in its current form. We would note that the recently enacted federal health reform does limit the use or the tax deductibility of health savings accounts as we understand it. We're still
took it from $5,000 down to $2,500.
Yes, sir.
But the current law says $5,000, and the new Obama plan calls for $2,500. So you ought to be willing to at least embrace $2,500. I mean, that's just...
I think we'd be happy to do that when you embrace the new federal law. Sorry, that wasn't fair. I apologize, Senator Cox.
No, truth matters. I'm not going to embrace the new current law because that's ultimately going to break the state of California, but in the United States of America. But in the meantime, what you do is you give the people who are employees, you give them the benefit of thinking that they have a brain and that they, in fact, can figure out how to use an HSA. And if you look at the statistics, you will find that the traditional plan costs this amount and the HSA costs this amount. And so as a result, what you have is a good deal for everyone that I don't understand why the unions don't take that.
I'll let labor speak for itself. On behalf of Health Access, the reason that we're not in support of this measure is that whether it's $2,500 or $5,000 out-of-pocket costs, that's a lot of money for somebody making $20,000 or $25,000 a year.
But they ought to be able to make that decision themselves. It ought not to be the result of an advocate coming before the California legislature making that decision for them. That's my point to you.
And my point to you would be that this legislature makes lots of decisions about what constitutes affordability for people, and that part of what the new plan will do, effective 2014, when California will receive 100% federal funding for those who are newly eligible for several years, will be to make sure that it's affordable for people of low and moderate income below 400% of poverty. These kinds of high deductibles will deter necessary care, and we'll be happy. I don't have an actuarial analysis, but we have plenty of academic studies that we're happy to provide you a summary of.
Thank you.
The committee's focused on other things. So.
Next.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, Jeremy Smith on behalf of the California Labor Federation. For the myriad reasons already stated by Beth and the gentleman before her, we're also in opposition. And I would just say to Senator Cox, not all union members are high-wage people, workers, and they tell us what they do and don't like and want, and that's how we are able to come before the legislature and
those people who don't want to take advantage of a higher deductible plan and use the health savings account ought to be able to do that if that's what they want. Not everybody comes out of the same mold.
Well, our concern is that people who would maybe take advantage of a HSA and then get sick can't then afford the care they need that the HSA won't cover.
I'm just sorry that you don't understand what HSA means.
Okay, well, for those, I'm opposed, and
I regret that. Well, that's all that counts. You know, I appreciate that.
Welcome.
Hi, Mr. Chairman, members of the Committee. Dave Lowe, California School Employees Association. We also oppose the bill. Our view is that the HSA concept really does encourage a big gamble. A lot of the younger, healthier people might take advantage of them, risking the fact that they are not going to have some sort of catastrophic sort of illness or that will take them into the higher deductible plan. And it is a gamble. I mean, when you're young and healthy, you pretty much feel like you're invincible. But in fact, young and healthy people get sick as well, and we don't think this is a good health care policy.
Thanks, sir. Anyone else who would like to speak in opposition? We departed from the normal procedure of a committee in allowing a fluid discussion back and forth. Senator Cox and those who were expressing themselves in opposition. I hope that no one minded that we accepted Senator Onestad's invitation to a debate. I think that constituted a good discussion of those positions in support and opposition. And so, Senator Onestad, if you'd like to close on your proposal.
Sure. Thank you. I think it's two things. One, this is an option. We're saying that the retirement system should offer it as one of the options, and so the entire argument that seems to try to tell you that this is going to force everybody into one system is not true. However, I will tell you that might be the unintended consequence, as I repeat, in Indiana, when they put this very same language into law several years ago, a few of the state workers chose that as an option. Now 70% of all of the state workers in Indiana choose it as an option because they have found it is what works best for them and their families. The San Diego Union Tribune editorialized a little while ago, quote, "Each time retiree medical benefits aren't fully funded by the annual budget, the increase of over long-term liability and makes the shortfall more costly." And the editorial ends up suggesting that only two things can happen with this philosophy. One, you either increase what you're going to pay for state workers in their retirement and health benefits, or two, you end those state retirement and medical benefits at some point in time. This gives you an option that has worked for 46 other states. It's time for this legislature, in my opinion, to vote for the people and not for the unions.
Thank you, Senator Onestad. That's your close. Is there a motion on the proposal?
Motion. So moved, Mr. Chair.
Senator Cox makes a motion at such time that the committee achieves a quorum, and we can conduct.
Does 3 not make a quorum?
It does not. The quorum is 4, and so I would encourage the other members of the committee to come directly.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Senator Onestad. Appreciate that very much. And I would inform those in attendance and the members of the committee that item number 2 on today's agenda, Senate Bill 1209 by Senator Romero, will be put off from today's calendar and heard instead on the 19th. So if you are here on Senate Bill 1209, that measure will not be heard today. Instead, it will be heard on April 19th. And so that takes us to the point in our proceedings where we await the arrival of the chair to present the first item on today's agenda. And the 5th item, Senator Simitian, has a measure before the committee. So unless there's anything further at this time, I would suggest that the committee is in recess until the arrival of those authors or committee members. Let me call the committee back to order. Senator Cox has noted that we now have a quorum, so if the secretary will please call the roll.
Correa.
Present.
Correa here. Ashburn.
Present.
Ashburn here. Corbett. Here. Corbett here. Cox. Cox here. Ducheney. Lou.
A quorum is established, and a motion has been made by Senator Cox on the consent calendar, which is item number 3, SB 1217, item number 6, SB 1479. Without any further discussion, let's call the roll.
Correa.
Aye.
Correa I. Ashburn.
Aye.
Ashburn I. Corbett.
Aye.
Corbett I. Cox. Cox I. Ducheney. Lou.
Mr. Chair, would it be appropriate to make a motion on item 4, SB 1262?
Oh, excuse me. I'm sorry. I'm not making that motion.
If you'd like to, we'd be delighted by this new development.
Senator Cox's motion.
Senator Cox had previously suggested a motion in support to do pass on item number 4, Senate Bill 1262 by Senator Onestad. If the clerk would please call the roll.
Correa.
Aye.
Correa I. Ashburn.
Aye.
Ashburn I. Corbett.
No.
Corbett no. Cox. Cox I. Ducheney. Lou.
Yeah. The vote is 3-1. We'll put that measure on call pending the arrival of the other members of the committee. And so now we will move to item number 1 on the agenda, which is Senate Bill 1139 by the chair of the committee, Senator Correa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Senate Bill 1139 is the CalPERS annual housekeeping bill, sponsored by CalPERS. The bill makes several technical and other changes to various sections of the government code administered by CalPERS, including allowing CalPERS to offer and manage after-tax retirement savings account for public employees. Currently, CalPERS offers and administers pre-tax savings programs to its members. However, changes in federal and state law have occurred since the enactment of the enabling statutes authorizing the establishment of the CalPERS Deferred Compensation Program in 1991. The expansion will allow CalPERS to better meet the needs of local agency employees who want to save for their retirement years. I have representatives from CalPERS with me today to answer any technical questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Welcome.
Thank you. Scott Blackledge from CalPERS. Our Board of Administration has voted to sponsor this measure to improve the services in the administration of the retirement system.
Thank you, sir. And let's call now for witnesses in support of the measure. Anyone who would like to testify in support? Anyone who would like to come forward in opposition to the measure? Senator Correa, you may close.
Ask for an aye vote.
Is that a motion?
I'm glad to move the bill, yes.
Senator Corbett moves the measure. Please call the roll.
Correa.
Aye.
Correa I. Ashburn.
Aye.
Ashburn I. Corbett.
Aye.
Corbett I. Cox. Aye. Cox I. Ducheney. Lou.
Aye.
Lou I.
Thank you. That measure has 5 votes in support. We'll leave the roll open for the arrival of one of our members. So, Senator Correa, that takes us to the only remaining item, which is item number 5, Senate Bill 1425 by Senator Simitian. Mr. Chair, I'll turn the committee back over to you and ask the sergeants to please contact Senator Simitian and to request that he come to the committee.
I recommend you give him 3 minutes otherwise.
Well, if you're going to empower me, we'll set it at 2.5 minutes. He's sprinting as we speak. Your timing is impeccable, sir.
Okay, get up here. Thank you, Mr. Simitian. Welcome. Thank you, sir. You may present.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members. This is Senate Bill 1425, which creates a uniform set of laws for both CalPERS and CalSTRS to prevent pension spiking. I should mention that there is an Assembly vehicle, Assembly Bill 1987 by Mr. Hernandez, that relates to what are commonly referred to as the 1937 Act retirement systems. A question I've gotten a lot lately with respect to this bill is, so where did this come from? How did this end up on my to-do list? And the answer is that it was an issue I heard about repeatedly during the year 2009, more than at any time during my 25 years in public service. Some of you know that I served as a local school board president, a mayor, county supervisor, and then here in the State Assembly and State Senate, going back now 25 plus years. I do not ever remember hearing the kind of concern that was voiced about public employee pensions that I heard this past year in town halls, sidewalk office hours, and other venues. As I had the conversations with folks, what was interesting to me is that I will tell you that I don't think people begrudge public employees a decent pension. That wasn't really at the core of what I was hearing. When I told people, look, most folks are folks who are in their 60s. Most folks are folks with 20, 25 years of service. Most folks are looking at somewhere between $2,000, maybe $2,500 a month in terms of employee pensions. That was not what was troubling people. What they always said then in response is, well, what about the story I read in the newspaper? And then they proceeded to describe the most recent incident. And I became convinced that there was a need for legislation to deal particularly with the issue of pension spiking, which I think members of this committee would be well aware is the practice of dramatically increasing an employee's final compensation in order to increase his or her pension. This measure would require that employee compensation during the final year or period for calculation be consistent with increases paid to other employees in the same or similar class, and it specifically prohibits cramming certain kinds of compensation into that last calculation period. The bill also deals with something called that I call revolving door double dipping, the practice of folks who leave their job on Friday and come back to essentially the same job on Monday. I do not begrudge anyone who has earned their retirement benefits the right to collect their retirement benefits, but when we create systems in which folks show up on Monday to do the work from which they have retired on Friday, I'm sure you can see both the financial impact and the impact in terms of the public's trust. And finally, the bill creates an audit and accountability process, including monetary penalties for noncompliance. Before I ask witnesses to come forward with your consent, Mr. Correa, I should acknowledge Mr. Correa, the chair of the committee, is the joint author. Mr. DeSaulnier on the Senate side is a co-author as well. Mr. Hernandez from the Assembly side is the principal co-author. I think the bill does three good things. I think it protects taxpayer dollars. I think it protects employee dollars, since they are the ones who rely on the solvency of the system. And I think it is an appropriate response to preserve public trust and support for a system that, in most instances, provides a decent, livable wage for people in their retiring years, which I think most of us can support. I would respectfully ask for an aye vote.
Thank you. Questions to the committee, Mr. Ashburn?
Yes, Senator Simitian, does your measure deal with the practice of an employee being promoted to another position within the same department or agency at a much higher rate of pay for a necessary period of time, most likely for the purposes of enhancing their retirement?
It does, and we have folks who are here from CalPERS or CalSTRS, and if you, through the chair, if you'd like to have them comment on how they see the provisions of the bill apply in those circumstances. But the bill specifically talks about limiting compensation in that final period to amounts that are over and above compensation increases that are received by others in the same class. We also deal with the challenge of what's known as the class of one, which is that sometimes folks will be put into a position which has only one spot, so we've indicated that there is no such thing as a class of one for purposes of compensation. And the language specifically empowers the governing body, whatever it may be, whether it's at the CalPERS or CalSTRS, to step in where there is evidence that the primary purpose for an increase was to spike the pension. So there's an opportunity there, even if the strict, even if we've missed a way, in effect, to game the system.
Thank you.
Quick question. You mentioned the second prohibition. can you be more specific? Somebody is on Friday working at one job, retires, and on Monday shows up. Is that prohibition against working within the CalPERS system, or is that coming back to that same job that they had? Clarify if I can. I'll get Mr. Blackledge.
Let me ask how the language is being interpreted. Thank you.
Scott Blackledge from CalPERS. The bill is consistent for both PERS and STRS. What happens is that if someone retires from an employer under the CalPERS system, they cannot go back to work for any other employer in that retirement system. They could perhaps go to work for a county that has a county retirement system, but any type of CalPERS employer they would not be able to return to for at least 180 days. Same goes for STRS as well.
Thank you. I wanted to look at the language of the bill, and I think the language of the bill is consistent with the explanation you just heard.
Thank you.
I guess this is more informational since we're only dealing with your measure, but you mentioned that Assemblymember Hernandez has a bill dealing with 21 counties and their retirement
37
systems
Act.
under the 1937 Act. What about that example of moving from a state agency into a local government agency, for example? Do you know offhand if that would be affected?
I'm going to not even look to my left and see if you get the same answer from both of us. That would not be precluded under the language of the bill.
That is correct. It's just employment for an employer in the same retirement system.
Mr. Blackledge, before you leave, I have another question. I think I know how it's handled, but I want to make sure. You have a situation where an elected official may be served in local government for X number of years, and his value is recognized, and one day they are appointed to administration position. So you're going from making, say, $1,000 as a locally elected per month to one that's making quite a bit of money more as administration member. Would that be considered spiking if they're, again, CalPERS at the local level and they come here at CalPERS? How would the bill handle that situation?
I'm going to, again, answer first without looking to my left for clues to make sure that we're all on the same page.
I think I know the answer, but I want to make sure we're
I'm going to tell you that the answer is no. It would not be considered spiking under either existing law or under the measure that you have before you. I'm going to tell you it would be called a healthy raise, and that is a healthy raise, assuming you had time in grade at that healthy raise. That would be the dollar amount that would be used for calculation purposes when it was time to look towards retirement.
So the way I would understand it, go ahead.
I'm sorry, Danny Brown from CalPERS. I will say that he is correct in the sense that the bill probably doesn't address it, but CalPERS does have in current law a provision that protects that in the sense that elected official, the final compensation for an elected official, I should say hired after 1994, is calculated separate from any other compensation they may have received. So, for example, if they were elected as a city council member in 2000 and was a city council member for 8 years, that 8 years would use the city council final comp, and if they got a position appointed or somewhere else, that position's final comp would be based on that final service. So the final comp would be computed separately. That's current CalPERS law. And that's for elected officials after 1994.
So it's kind of a fair situation where you get retirement based on what you did city council, then separately the retirement will be based on what you did here. It's not all spiked up, so to speak. Good. I'm glad to hear that. And I'd presume that the same thing would be under the 1937 Act, or you feel not? I wouldn't begin to speculate.
Wouldn't begin to speculate.
I will ask that same question from Mr. Hernandez as well, because I think whatever we do here or this law that you've just described should be also the case in 1937 Act.
Could I interrupt just a moment? I think what the witness is telling you, Mr. Chairman, is this bill does not affect that process. I think what the witness is telling you is that there was a change in law in the 90s.
That's correct.
And that change in law remains in force without regard to my legislation.
And I just wanted to clarify that because the state of the law, I think, is something acceptable, and if it wouldn't be, then I would be looking for amendments. But thank you very much. Further questions from the committee? Yes, Ms.
I don't know
Corbett.
if any opposition is going to be here today, but I do know that there has been some opposition raised with, I'd just like to know how you address the concern. There are some entities that are worried that they may not be able to hire people to fill open positions.
Right.
I think you know what I'm alluding to. I'm just wondering how do you address those issues? I understand you have a 6-month period. Maybe that takes care of it. But how do you address that concern that's been raised?
If I could take just a big step back to provide some context in response to the question, because I think this is an interesting issue, members, in terms of how there are two different points of view, and how you see it depends on where you sit. For retirees, they understandably say, this is my retirement. I earned it. I'm following the law. You calculate it based on my years of service and by my pay rate. And my number of years times my pay rate and my final compensation period. And what's the problem? When you talk to members of the public, they have a very different take on this. Their take is, I think it's appropriate, say the members of the public, to be providing retirement for folks in their later years, but it gets under their skin a little bit when someone gets a retirement starting on Friday and then comes back to work drawing a full-time paycheck on Monday. And interestingly, Senator, one of the pushbacks I got on this was from someone who said, well, we sometimes use this to train a replacement. So we get a replacement, and I said, well, wait a minute. So now you're paying the replacement in the position a check, you're paying the person you brought back a check, and they're drawing their retirement. So now we're talking about 3 checks for the same position. That really raises some concerns. Now, that's the context. To your question, I would respectfully point out, we're losing people from public agencies left and right. If ever there was a time when there were plenty of folks out there who can be called back, this is that time. I had a particular concern, which I'm guessing you might share given your role as chair of the Judiciary Committee, about what are referred to as subordinate judicial officers. That program has already been underway for 2 years, so there is already a pool of folks who have already moved out of those SJO positions, as they refer to them, and that's available even if somebody couldn't turn around for a 6-month period and do it. And then, of course, the retired judges could take those positions. They're not typically inclined to, as I understand, because many of them, unfortunately, are not wild about family court or traffic court, even though those are, in my view, important venues. But I think the pool of folks that's already out there is sufficient given the number of retirements we've had in recent years and the current employment situation. And again, the goal here is that if people are going to retire because they really want to retire, good for them and as it should be, but to retire on a Friday and come back on a Monday so that there's an opportunity to do a revolving door, I think does the public and the employees a disservice.
Further questions from the committee? The will of the committee? You have a motion? Do we call opposition before we move?
I'm not sure we've called support or opposition.
Support. Let's get support in. I'm sorry. Go ahead, support, please.
Chair Correa, members of the committee, Randy Cheek with SEIU 1000. For all the reasons that Senator Simitian greatly brought forth, we are in wholehearted support of this bill.
Thank you.
I would call it great, adequate explanation.
Thank you for that acknowledgement of adequacy, Senator.
Further support?
Chair.
Opposition?
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. Irene Ortega with the California State Association of Counties. We are opposed specifically to the 180-day issue. We're not opposed to the pension spiking issues in the bill. The issue for us is one of flexibility, and we are concerned that a blanket 180 days doesn't provide any flexibility for the times when a position becomes vacant because a recruitment didn't pan out, and the retiree who was most recently in that position is the natural person to fill the vacancy. I am sensitive to the issues about the retire on Friday and come back on Monday, and I think we could certainly look at some ways of tightening the restrictions, especially when you look at early retirees or people who are offered retirement incentives, and definitely put some tighter restrictions on those. But we do think a blanket 6 months is too much. The 6 months also triggers background checks for former employees who, once the 6 months lapse, we might have to go back through a background check. So, our position is we would hope that this provision would be taken out of the bill, but at a minimum, we'd like to continue working on whether there's any flexibility that could be provided as the bill goes forward.
Thank you very much. Further opposition, support? Seeing none, we have a motion.
Just a comment on it seems to me that this is the first step with this particular bill, and there's going to be plenty of opportunity to address that. And I know that you heard that, Senator Simitian, with respect to that flexibility, especially in that circumstance where a recruitment took place for that potential retired position. No one acceptable is found, and the incumbent is asked to come back in. Some flexibility there. If you'll work on that, I'm not suggesting we not vote today, but if you'll
through the chair, I am willing to look at it, but I want to offer a couple of caveats. The first is I worry in cases like this that all of a sudden the exception swallows the rule. Yeah. I also want to point out that part of the reason we're here is because the more convoluted, this is one of the more challenging bills if you looked at the 25 pages of text. We're in a pretty complicated area here, and that kind of complication not only allows, but one might even say incentivizes people to game the system. So my commitment is, I'm happy to keep having those conversations, but I didn't want to be overly optimistic about some of the challenges that are there. Thank you, Senator. Thank you.
Mr. Simitian, I would also concur with your statements that, this one becomes problematic, 180, but I think that's kind of, in many ways, the heart of this bill. So I'm willing to vote for it as is. Yes,
Chairman,
Mr.
I want
Cox.
to salute Senator Simitian for bringing this up. I'm sure many of you read the editorial in the Sacramento Bee where it talked about spike pensions can't be defended, dated May 24, 2010. And interestingly enough, to the comments that you made, Senator Simitian, about the people being angry, there are a significant number of people out there who believe that a straightforward way to stop pension spiking would be to define final compensation strictly as base pay and nothing more. And then they have a reasonable argument, because when you go down to Contra Costa County and find that a fire chief at age 51, final year salary was $221, and when he retired with $284,000 of annual pension. So I salute you for your work today, and believe that we may very well need some additional work on this, but certainly this is the step in the right direction.
Thank you, sir.
Further comments from the committee? Seeing none, please call the roll.
Correa.
Aye.
Correa, aye. Ashburn.
Aye.
Ashburn, aye. Corbett.
Aye.
Corbett, aye. Cox.
Aye.
Cox, aye. Ducheney. Liu.
Aye.
Liu, aye.
Thank you very much. That measure has 5 votes, and we'll put that measure on call.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, members.
Thank you very much. We have one more item, Senator Romero's bill. Yeah, and that's what I was going to say. That has been pulled and put over to the next meeting. Thank you very much.
your timing is perfect, Madam Budget Chair.
That being said, let's go over the roll of the bills and make sure we add everybody on before we adjourn the committee. Madam Secretary, call the absent members.
Item number 1, SB 1139, Ducheney.
I'm sorry.
SB 1139, item number 1, Ducheney.
Aye.
Ducheney, aye.
That's 6-0, and that bill is out.
Item number 4, SB 1262, Ducheney.
No.
Ducheney, no. Liu. Liu, no.
That item has 3 votes ayes, 3 votes no. That measure fails. Reconsideration granted.
There might be a way to do that. It's just... Item number 5, SB 14.
Can I just ask a question on that one, Mr. Chairman?
Please.
Just since I unfortunately was in the other committee. I mean, I think that part of the problem with it is timing in terms of the new federal health bill, and also the impact that it could have on the lives that remain in a program if these healthier folks basically choose this alternative. When it was for an outside person to choose that and then new possible health exchange that might exist, it seems like it might be something. But when you do it inside a system, I don't know how it might impact those who might be left in the system, could end up with much higher costs. Did some of that discussion come up? Because that's the reasons. It's not a philosophical objection, but I think there are some practical. Did you? Okay.
Well, that measure fails. Then granted reconsideration.
Item number 5, SB 1425. Ducheney.
Were there any amendments taken to this?
No.
Or discussed? Or?
We discussed the 180-day portion of the bill, but nothing was amended.
Okay. All right. Aye.
Ducheney, aye.
That measure has 6 aye votes. That measure's out. Consent calendar. That's Senate Bill 1217 and Senate Bill 1479. Please call the absent members.
Ducheney?
Aye.
Ducheney, aye. Lou?
Aye.
Lou, aye.
That has 6 votes. Consent calendar is out. I believe that concludes the business of this committee. This committee is now adjourned. Thank you.